You have seen the videos, you have heard the whispers, you have been presented with the startling and often unsettling parallels between the foundational stories of the Book of Genesis and the far more ancient myths of Sumeria and Babylon. You have been shown how the story of Adam's creation from clay, of Eve's birth from a rib, and of Noah's survival from a great flood seem to be direct echoes of tales that were carved into clay tablets thousands of years before the first Hebrew scribe ever put ink to parchment. And you have been left with a disturbing and often faith-shaking question. Is the Bible just a copy? Is our sacred history merely a later, edited, monotheistic version of the polytheistic sagas of the Anunnaki? This is the question that many researchers and content creators leave hanging in the air. A question designed to deconstruct your faith and to leave you adrift in a sea of historical relativism. But what if that is the wrong question entirely? What if the profound similarities between these two sets of records are not evidence of plagiarism, but are instead the corroborating testimony of two different witnesses describing the same single catastrophic historical event from two radically different perspectives? The real question is not if the Bible copied the story of the Anunnaki. The real question, the one that unlocks the entire mystery, the question that the gatekeepers of both secular and religious history do not want you to ask, is this: who were the Anunnaki really? Before we can answer that question, we must first open the case file. We must establish with clarity the profile of these mysterious beings as they are presented in their own historical records. Our investigation begins in the dust of ancient Mesopotamia, in the fragmented but powerful testimony of the Sumerian and Babylonian cuneiform tablets. When we assemble these fragments, a consistent and startling portrait of the Anunnaki emerges. First and most fundamentally, they are described as beings who came from the heavens to the earth. They are not native to this planet. They are an extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional race, a group of powerful beings who descended from the sky. Second, they are presented as the bringers of civilization. They are credited with teaching humanity the foundational arts of agriculture, of law, of architecture, and of astronomy. They are the great primordial teachers of mankind. Third, and most critically for our investigation, they are described as having physically interacted and interbred with the human race. The myths are filled with stories of these gods taking human wives and producing a variety of semi-divine or hybrid offspring, beings who often acted as kings or intermediaries between the gods and men. Fourth, the primary purpose of their interaction with humanity was not benevolent. The tablets are clear that they genetically engineered or fashioned a race of human workers, the Lulu, specifically to serve them, to toil in their mines and to build their cities. And finally, their society was not a monolith. It was a complex hierarchy, a pantheon of gods with a clear chain of command, led by powerful, named figures like Anu, Enlil, and Enki. This is the profile. This is the testimony of the clay tablets. A race of celestial beings who descended from heaven, taught humanity advanced knowledge, interbred with them to create a hybrid race, and established a hierarchical kingdom on earth. Let us hold this profile in our minds as we now turn to our second witness. Faced with this clear and ancient profile of the Anunnaki and its hauntingly precise parallels to the stories of Genesis, the institutional church has, for centuries, adopted a strategy of profound and deliberate silence. When confronted with the evidence from the clay tablets, the official response has been, and largely remains, one of dismissive avoidance. This is a critical piece of our investigation, because the nature of this silence is not one of ignorance, but of strategic necessity. The gatekeepers of Orthodox tradition, represented by institutions like the Vatican, were confronted with an impossible theological dilemma. To openly and honestly address the similarities between the Sumerian myths and the biblical narrative would be to force them into one of two equally disastrous admissions. The first option would be to admit that the biblical writers had, in fact, borrowed, adapted, and edited the older myths of Mesopotamia. This would be to concede the argument of the secular historians, an admission that would fatally undermine the Church's claim that the Bible is a unique and divinely inspired revelation. If Genesis is just a Hebrew retelling of the Enuma Elish, then its authority is shattered. The second option, however, is in many ways even more terrifying. It would be to admit that the similarities exist because both the Sumerian myths and the biblical narrative are attempting to describe the same single, real, historical event. It would be to admit that the gods of the pagans were not just fictional characters, but were real, powerful, non-human entities who did, in fact, descend from the heavens and interact with primordial humanity. This admission, while preserving the historical reality of the biblical account, would open a Pandora's box of cosmic horrors. It would validate a supernatural worldview that the modern, rationalized church has worked for centuries to suppress. Faced with these two impossible choices, to either sacrifice their claim to divine revelation or to admit to a terrifying supernatural history, the gatekeepers chose a third and far more effective option: silence. They chose to not engage with the evidence at all. They ignored the clay tablets. They labeled the parallels as mere coincidence, and they taught a version of Genesis that was hermetically sealed from its own broader, ancient Near Eastern context. But this silence was not a solution. It was a cover-up, and it was a cover-up that was made necessary by the explosive testimony of the very books that they themselves had banned. While the Vatican and mainstream theology chose a strategy of silence, the key to solving this entire mystery, the Rosetta Stone that harmonizes the testimony of the clay tablets with the testimony of the scrolls, has been waiting patiently in the pages of the forbidden books. We must now open our second case file. We must turn to the uncensored chronicle of the Book of Enoch and examine its detailed intelligence report on the angelic beings known as the Watchers. As we have seen in our previous investigations, the Book of Enoch provides a detailed, historical and legalistic account of a specific and catastrophic event in primordial history. And when we lay its profile of the Watchers side by side with the Sumerian profile of the Anunnaki, the parallels are not just similar, they are identical. Let us examine the evidence. The Anunnaki are described as beings who came from the heavens to the earth. The Book of Enoch begins its account with the story of 200 angels who, in a coordinated mutiny, descended upon the earth from the heavenly realms. The Anunnaki are credited with teaching humanity the arts of civilization. The Book of Enoch provides a detailed list of the specific forbidden knowledge that the Watchers taught to mankind: the forging of weapons, the secrets of sorcery, the arts of seduction, and the science of astrology. The Anunnaki are described as interbreeding with human women to create a hybrid race. The Book of Enoch states that the central crime of the Watchers was that they took wives for themselves from among the daughters of men, and that their hybrid offspring were the monstrous giants known as the Nephilim. And finally, the Anunnaki had a complex pantheon and a hierarchical structure. The Book of Enoch provides the very same, listing the specific names of the chief commanders of the fallen Watchers, Samyaza, Azazel, and others, who led this celestial mutiny. The dossier is a perfect match. The Anunnaki of the Sumerian tablets and the Watchers of the Book of Enoch are not two different groups of beings. They are two different names from two different cultural perspectives for the exact same historical invading force. Let us now step into the role of forensic investigators and place the two dossiers, Exhibit A and Exhibit B, side by side on the evidence table. The connections are no longer a matter of vague similarities or poetic echoes. When examined with care, the correlation is a direct, point-for-point, and legally indisputable match. We are not just looking at two similar stories, we are looking at two independent witness testimonies describing the exact same crime. Consider the points of correlation. Point 1. The origin. The Sumerian tablets state that the Anunnaki came from the heavens to the earth. The Book of Enoch states that the Watchers descended from the heavenly realms. The origin is identical. Point 2. The mission. The Anunnaki are credited with bringing advanced knowledge and the arts of civilization to a primitive humanity. The Book of Enoch provides a detailed and specific list of the forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, sorcery, astrology that the Watchers taught to mankind. The core action is identical. Point 3. The crime. The Sumerian myths are filled with stories of the gods taking human women as wives and producing semi-divine offspring. The Book of Enoch states that the central foundational sin of the Watchers was that they took daughters of men as wives, an act of forbidden admixture. The central crime is identical. Point 4. The result. The unions in the Sumerian myths produced a race of heroes, demigods, or kings. The unions in the Book of Enoch produced the Nephilim, a race of powerful, violent giants. The biological result is identical. Point 5. The command structure. The Anunnaki were not a monolith. They were a pantheon with a clear hierarchy of named leaders like Enki and Enlil. The Watchers were not a disorganized mob. They were a legion of 200 operating under a clear command structure with named leaders like Samyaza and Azazel. The organizational structure is identical. This is not a case of one culture borrowing a few story ideas from another. This is a case of two different cultures recording from their own unique perspectives the same catastrophic, world-altering historical event. The Anunnaki are the Watchers, and this realization is the key that unlocks the entire mystery. With this indisputable match now established, we can finally provide the answer to the question that the secular historians and the silent theologians have both refused to consider. The Anunnaki of the Sumerian myths were not gods, and they were not extraterrestrial aliens in the modern scientific sense. They were the fallen angels, the celestial traitors of the biblical narrative. This single, powerful realization reframes the entire history of ancient religion. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Akkadians, they were not just inventing fanciful stories about a pantheon of imaginary gods. They were, in a very real sense, recording history. but they were recording it from the perspective of a conquered and colonized people. Imagine the scenario: a group of powerful, technologically advanced, and seemingly immortal beings descend from the sky. They can teach you how to forge weapons, how to read the stars, how to build cities. They can heal your sick and destroy your enemies. They take your daughters as wives and produce offspring of immense strength and power. For a primitive, pre-flood humanity, what other word would you have for such beings but gods? The Sumerian and Babylonian myths are, therefore, not a fiction. They are a form of non-fiction. They are the historical and theological record of a people who had been subjugated by a technologically and spiritually superior occupying force. They worshipped the Anunnaki as gods because, from their limited perspective, that is exactly what they appeared to be. The Sumerian tablets are not a rival mythology to the Bible. They are a tragic, paganized history of the successful pre-flood invasion and colonization of planet Earth by a legion of rebellious celestial beings. They are the story of the cosmic war, but told from the perspective of the collaborators. If the Sumerian and Babylonian tablets are the historical record of the collaborators, the tragic account of a humanity that chose to worship its celestial colonizers, then what is the Bible? The Book of Genesis, when read in this light, is no longer just another ancient creation myth. It is the counter-narrative. It is the official report of the divine resistance. This is the key to understanding why the biblical account is both so similar to and so different from the Mesopotamian myths. The biblical authors, writing under divine inspiration, were not ignorant of the Sumerian stories. On the contrary, they were engaging in a direct and polemical act of historical and theological correction. They were taking the popular, paganized narrative of their time, the story of the glorious Anunnaki gods, and they were systematically deconstructing it, exposing it for what it truly was. Where the Sumerian myths celebrated the Watchers as the bringers of civilization, the biblical narrative condemns them as the purveyors of a forbidden and corrupting knowledge. Where the Mesopotamian stories glorified the hybrid Nephilim as mighty men of renown, the biblical account frames their very existence as a monstrous abomination that necessitated a global, cleansing judgment. The Bible is not copying the myths. It is waging a narrative war against the myths. It is the lone, dissenting voice in the ancient world, the one historical record that refuses to call the invaders gods. It is the one chronicle that correctly identifies them as rebellious angels, as cosmic criminals, as traitors to the one true and unseen Creator God. The Book of Genesis is not a later, edited version of the Sumerian stories. It is a divinely inspired intelligence briefing, a report from the side of the heavenly government, designed to correct the historical record and to expose the true treacherous identity of the so-called gods who had, for a time, successfully subjugated the entire planet. It is the one and only surviving report from the side of the resistance. And now, with this complete, uncensored history in hand, we can finally understand the true fear of the Vatican. We can decode the real reason behind their centuries of strategic silence. The popular narrative, the one presented by our competitor, is that the Vatican feared the Anunnaki because the Sumerian myths were older than the biblical stories, and that this chronological priority threatened the Bible's claim to uniqueness. But this is a superficial and ultimately incorrect diagnosis. The true fear of the Vatican was not that the Sumerian myths were a rival and older version of the story. The true fear of the Vatican was that the Sumerian myths were a powerful, external, and non-biblical piece of corroborating evidence for the literal, historical truth of the Book of Enoch. Think of the strategic nightmare this created for the institutional church. For centuries after the Council of Nicaea, they had been engaged in a successful campaign to suppress and discredit the Book of Enoch. They had labeled it as a fantasy, a piece of wild Jewish mysticism that was not to be taken seriously. They had created a safe, sanitized version of primordial history that had no room for a literal, angelic invasion. And then, in the 19th century, archaeologists began digging in the sands of Iraq, and they unearthed the Sumerian tablets. And these tablets, written by a completely different culture, in a completely different language, with no connection to the biblical tradition, told the exact same unbelievable story. A story of celestial beings descending from heaven, of their interbreeding with humanity, of their transfer of advanced knowledge, of their hybrid, giant offspring. The Anunnaki were not a threat because they were different. They were a threat because they were the same. They were a corroborating witness, a second, independent testimony that threatened to resurrect the very history that the Church had spent over 1,000 years trying to bury. The Vatican did not fear a rival mythology. It feared a historical fact. The discovery of the Sumerian tablets created a strategic crisis for the gatekeepers of the redacted, orthodox narrative. The Anunnaki became the most dangerous kind of witness, a hostile, independent, and incorruptible one. And this witness was testifying in favor of the very books that the Church had condemned. Consider the dilemma. As long as the story of the Watchers and the Nephilim was confined to the pages of the Book of Enoch, a book they had successfully marginalized, they could control the narrative. They could dismiss Enoch as a bizarre, one-off fantasy, a piece of Jewish folklore that had been rightly excluded from the canon. They could isolate the witness and discredit his testimony. But the Sumerian tablets changed the game entirely. Suddenly, there was a second voice, a powerful, ancient, and undeniably historical voice from outside the biblical tradition that was telling the same core story. The Church could not dismiss the Sumerians as heretical Jewish mystics. They could not burn the clay tablets as they had burned the Gnostic Gospels. They could not easily explain away the stunning point-for-point parallels as a mere coincidence. The Anunnaki became the corroborating witness that threatened to reopen the entire cold case of Genesis chapter 6. They were the external proof that the Book of Enoch was not a fantasy, but was, in fact, a theologically accurate account of a real, historical event that had been remembered in a distorted but recognizable form by the oldest civilizations on Earth. The fear of the Anunnaki was not a fear of a pagan myth. It was a fear that this pagan myth would lend a new and unstoppable credibility to the very biblical history that they had worked so hard to suppress. The clay tablets were a threat because they held the power to resurrect the authority of the scrolls, and that was a possibility that the institutional church could not afford to entertain. Ultimately, the decision to ignore and effectively suppress the connection between the Anunnaki and the Watchers was a final, desperate attempt to hide the true scale of the cosmic war. To acknowledge this connection would be to admit that the strange, supernatural events described in the forbidden books were not just isolated mythological tales. It would be to admit that they were part of a coherent, global, and historically verifiable event. To connect the Anunnaki to the Watchers would be to admit that the pre-flood world was, in fact, the site of a literal, physical, and extra-dimensional invasion. It would be to admit that the gods of the ancient pagan world were not just imaginary figures, but were real, powerful, and rebellious celestial beings. It would be to admit that the Great Flood was not just a punishment for human immorality, but was a necessary, divine, military-style intervention to stop a full-scale genetic and technological takeover of the planet. This is a worldview that is simply too big, too wild, and too terrifying for the small, safe, and manageable religion that the gatekeepers sought to create. It shatters the comfortable barrier between our sacred history and their pagan myths, revealing that both are simply different perspectives on the same, single, horrifying conflict. The Vatican and the institutions that followed feared the Anunnaki because the Anunnaki were the proof. They were the archaeological and mythological evidence that the censored, supernatural worldview of the Book of Enoch was not a fantasy. It was a fact. And to admit that fact would be to force the entire church to reawaken to the reality of a cosmic war that is far older, far stranger, and far more real than they have ever been led to believe. And that was a truth they were simply not prepared to face. With this uncensored strategic understanding now in place, we can confidently rewrite the history of our ancient world. We are no longer trapped in the false dichotomy that the gatekeepers created for us. The choice between believing that the Bible is a unique, divinely inspired text with no connection to the world around it, or believing that it is a late, derivative, and plagiarized text that simply copied the older myths. The truth is a third and far more powerful option. The history of the primordial world begins not with myths, but with a real historical event, an event that is most accurately described in the divinely preserved chronicles of Enoch and Jubilees, a mutiny of a class of angelic beings known as the Watchers, and their subsequent invasion and corruption of the primordial earth. This single historical event then created two distinct streams of memory, two different records of the same crime. The first stream was the pagan one. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, and the other ancient cultures, having directly experienced these powerful, technologically advanced beings, remembered them as gods. Their myths, the stories of the Anunnaki, are the corrupted, human-centric, and ultimately idolatrous record of this event, told from the perspective of a conquered and colonized people. The second stream was the sacred one. The biblical authors, writing under divine inspiration, remembered the same event, but they recorded it from the perspective of heaven's government. Their record, preserved in the cryptic verses of Genesis and the explicit details of the uncensored chronicles, is not a copy of the pagan myths. It is a divine correction of them. It is the official, legal, and theologically accurate report of the resistance, the one that correctly identifies the gods as criminals and the bringers of civilization as cosmic traitors. We are not dealing with a case of plagiarism. We are dealing with a case of competing historical testimonies, and only one of them tells the truth about who was really in charge. This restored history forces us to confront a staggering and deeply uncomfortable reality. The gods of the ancient pagan world were not just the fanciful inventions of primitive, superstitious minds. They were not just poetic personifications of the forces of nature. The unified testimony of the Sumerian tablets and the uncensored biblical chronicles leads to a single, explosive conclusion. The gods of old were real. They were not, of course, gods in the ultimate sense. They were not the uncreated, eternal creator of all things. but they were real, powerful, intelligent, and non-human entities who descended from the heavenly realms, walked the earth, ruled over men, and were worshipped as divine beings. The pantheons of the ancient world, the Anunnaki of Sumer, the Titans of Greece, the Aesir of the Norsemen, are not just fiction. They are the distorted, deified, and often romanticized cultural memories of the fallen watchers and their monstrous hybrid offspring, the Nephilim. This is a truth that changes our entire understanding of religious history. The story of humanity is not a simple, linear progression from polytheism to monotheism, from a primitive belief in many gods to an enlightened belief in one God. It is a far more complex and tragic story. It is the story of a humanity that, in its infancy, had a direct and catastrophic encounter with a legion of real but rebellious celestial beings. And in the aftermath of that encounter, in the long, dark amnesia that followed the Great Flood, the memory of those powerful, traumatic beings was preserved in the only way the scattered survivors knew how, by calling them gods and worshipping them. Paganism, therefore, is not just a primitive error. It is a form of collective historical trauma. It is the long, sad, and idolatrous echo of a real historical invasion. The Vatican and the institutional church feared this truth because it shatters the neat and tidy line between our faith and their myths. It reveals that we are all, in a sense, grappling with the same ancient memory. The difference is that one tradition has continued to worship the memory of the invaders, while the other has preserved the record of the one true king who defeated them. The war for the narrative, the conflict between the true history of the Watchers and the distorted memory of the Anunnaki, did not end in the ancient world. It continues to this very day, in a new and modern form. The seductive and dangerous idea of powerful, non-human gods intervening in human affairs to help us is not a dead myth. It is a thriving and rapidly growing modern religion. Consider the explosion of the ancient aliens or ancient astronauts theory in our contemporary culture. This is a movement that on the surface appears to be scientific and historical. It points to the same evidence that we have examined, the impossible megaliths, the advanced knowledge of ancient civilizations, the cross-cultural myths of gods descending from the sky. But what is the explanation it offers? It tells us that these were benevolent extraterrestrials, wise and powerful beings from other planets who came to Earth to guide our evolution, to give us technology, and to act as our creators. Do you see the pattern? This is not a new theory. It is the oldest lie in the book, repackaged in the language of science fiction. The Anunnaki have simply been rebranded as aliens. The fallen watchers have been transformed into friendly space brothers. The forbidden transfer of corrupting technology is now presented as an act of benevolent evolutionary uplift. This is the modern echo of the Anunnaki deception. It is a powerful and seductive narrative that once again invites humanity to place its hope and its worship in powerful, created beings rather than in the one, true, uncreated creator. It is a story that absolves humanity of its own responsibility and presents us as the passive subjects of a grand galactic experiment. And it is a story that is being promoted with an almost religious fervor through popular television shows, best-selling books, and a vast online ecosystem. The war for the narrative is still raging, and the Anunnaki are no longer just a memory on a clay tablet. They are a modern and highly effective form of spiritual deception. To live in a world where this ancient Anunnaki deception is now being actively and skillfully repackaged for a modern audience, is to be called to a new and urgent level of spiritual discernment. The forbidden history that we have unearthed is not just a fascinating story, it is a critical and indispensable weapon in this ongoing narrative war. To know the true, uncensored history of the Watchers and the Nephilim is to be permanently inoculated against the lie of the benevolent ancient aliens. When you have read the divine indictment from the Book of Enoch, when you understand that these celestial beings were not saviors, but mutineers, not helpers, but colonizers, you can no longer be seduced by the modern, sanitized version of their story. This is the power of a true, historical, and biblically grounded framework. It does not just give you more information, it gives you a lens of discernment. It is a tool that allows you to analyze the stories, the ideologies, and the spiritual movements of our time, and to identify their ancient primordial roots. It allows you to look at the promises of the modern Anunnaki narrative, the promise of a technological salvation, of a secret, elite knowledge, of a human evolution guided by higher beings, and to recognize them for what they are, the same old Edenic lies dressed up in the shiny metallic costumes of science fiction. The greatest weapon in this final war is not power, but perception. It is the ability to distinguish between the echo of a divine truth and the echo of a primordial deception. And that ability is not a mystical gift. It is a skill that is forged in the hard and patient work of spiritual archaeology. It is the result of being willing to dig for the original, uncensored records, to listen to the silenced witnesses, and to build your worldview not on the shifting sands of popular myths, but on the unshakable bedrock of the divine historical account. The restoration of this uncensored history finally liberates us from the false dichotomy, the intellectual prison that the gatekeepers of both secularism and redacted religion have constructed for us. For centuries we have been told that we have only two choices when we look at the ancient past. The first choice is the path of mainstream institutional faith. It is a path that demands we accept the canonical Bible as a unique and divinely inspired text that exists in a kind of historical vacuum with no real or meaningful connection to the broader world of ancient myth and literature. To walk this path, we are often forced to ignore, to deny, or to explain away the staggering and undeniable parallels between the stories of Genesis and the older stories of Sumeria. It is a path of faith, but a faith that must often be maintained by a willful and uncomfortable blindness to the historical evidence. The second choice is the path of mainstream secular history. It is a path that looks at the same evidence, acknowledges the chronological priority of the Sumerian myths, and concludes that the Bible must therefore be a derivative, unoriginal, and ultimately a plagiarized work. It is a path of intellectual honesty, but an honesty that is built on a materialistic worldview that refuses from the outset to even consider the possibility of a supernatural, historical reality. But the Uncensored Chronicle reveals a third path, a path that is both intellectually honest and theologically faithful. It is the path that recognizes that the Bible and the Sumerian myths are not a case of an original and a copy. They are a case of a true historical report and a corrupted, paganized memory of the same single historical event. This is not a choice between faith and history. It is the glorious and liberating synthesis of both. This third path, This restored, synthesized understanding of ancient history does not weaken the authority of the biblical narrative. On the contrary, it strengthens it in a profound and unexpected way. By acknowledging the historical reality of the Watcher invasion, and by recognizing the pagan myths as the distorted memory of that event, we are no longer forced to defend the Bible against the claims of secular history. Instead, we can now use secular history and mythology as a powerful, external, and corroborating witness to the truth of the biblical account. The existence of a global, cross-cultural memory of giant kings and a great flood is no longer a problem for the faith. It becomes one of its greatest proofs. The fact that the Sumerians, the Greeks, the Norsemen, and dozens of other ancient cultures all remembered a version of this story is a powerful testament to the fact that the event they are all remembering was real, historical, and had a global impact. And in the midst of all these fractured and often self-glorifying accounts, the biblical narrative, as preserved in Genesis and clarified in the uncensored Chronicles, stands apart. It is the one and only account that is not a myth. It is a legal indictment. It is the one version of the story that is told not from the perspective of the human collaborators who worship their conquerors, but from the perspective of the divine government that judged them. This is the unshakable foundation of our faith. We are not afraid of the clay tablets. We are not afraid of the ancient myths. We welcome them as hostile witnesses whose own testimony, when properly cross-examined, ultimately ends up confirming the very historical reality that our own sacred and often suppressed records have been declaring all along. The echoes of Sumer do not undermine the voice of Scripture, they amplify it. The cosmic conflict that began before Adam is, therefore, not just a war of armies and territories. It is, at its deepest level, a war of memory. It is a struggle for control of the historical narrative. The ultimate goal of the enemy, from the very beginning, has not just been to conquer humanity, but to convince humanity to accept a false and self-aggrandizing version of his own story. Consider the two competing narratives that have been at war since the pre-flood world. The first is the narrative of the Anunnaki, the story told by the enemy. In this version, the fallen watchers are not traitors. They are gods. They are not colonizers. They are benefactors. They are not corrupters. They are the bringers of enlightenment. Their interbreeding with humanity is not a crime. It is the creation of a glorious, semi-divine royal line. This is a story of self-deification, a narrative that paints rebellion as a heroic and liberating act. The second is the narrative of Yahweh, the story told in the sacred texts. In this version, the Watchers are not gods, they are cosmic criminals. They are not benefactors, they are spiritual terrorists. Their enlightenment was a forbidden transfer of corrupting technology. And their offspring, the Nephilim, were not a royal line. They were a monstrous abomination that had to be wiped from the face of the earth. This is a story of divine justice, a narrative that paints rebellion as a catastrophic and world-destroying crime. This is the war of memory. And every choice you make, every story you choose to believe, is an act of allegiance in this war. To accept the modern, secularized version of the Anunnaki myth, the story of the benevolent ancient astronauts, is to unknowingly side with the primordial propaganda of the fallen kingdom. But to accept the biblical and uncensored account of the Watchers is to side with the historical record of the divine resistance. The battle for the planet is, and always has been, a battle for the story. To navigate this ancient and ongoing war of memory, we cannot afford to fight with a redacted and incomplete intelligence briefing. We must have the courage to consult the entire uncensored library. This is the core mission of our channel and our community. We are not here to create a new canon, but to reassemble the complete strategic dossier that was available to the first-century believers. This means we must read the canonical 66 books of the Bible as our foundational and ultimately authoritative text, the divinely inspired core of all truth. But we must learn to read it with a new awareness of its historical context. We must see it not as a book that fell out of heaven in a vacuum, but as a book that was written in direct conversation and often in direct conflict with the other powerful narratives of its time. And to understand that context, we must have the courage to also read the uncensored chronicles, the books like Enoch and Jubilees. We read them not as infallible scripture, but as what they are: essential, historical, and theologically rich intelligence reports that fill in the gaps, decode the cryptic passages, and restore the cosmic, supernatural worldview of the biblical authors themselves. And finally, we must even be willing to read the corrupted files, the enemy's own propaganda, the pagan myths of the Sumerians and the Greeks. We do not read them to find truth, but to understand the lie. We study them as a modern intelligence analyst studies the propaganda of a rival nation, to understand their worldview, to identify their deceptions, and to more fully appreciate the profound and revolutionary truth of our own, divinely preserved historical record. To be a true spiritual archaeologist is to be a student of the entire uncensored library. And so, our investigation has brought us to a new and powerful synthesis. We began with a troubling question, a question posed by our competitor. Did the Bible copy the more ancient myths of the Anunnaki? We have seen that this is the wrong question entirely. The true story is far grander, far more coherent, and far more consistent with the biblical worldview. The complete picture is this. In primordial history, a real, physical, and supernatural event occurred. A legion of rebellious angels, the Watchers, descended to earth and established a corrupt and violent kingdom. This single historical event created two streams of memory. The first was the pagan memory, preserved in the clay tablets of Sumer, which remembered these powerful beings as gods and recorded their story in the distorted, self-glorifying language of myth. The second was the sacred memory, preserved in the scrolls of the Hebrew tradition, which remembered these same beings as cosmic criminals and recorded their story in the precise judicial language of a divine indictment. The Vatican and the later institutional church did not fear the Anunnaki because they were a rival myth. They feared the Anunnaki because their story, preserved in the hard archaeological evidence of the clay tablets, was a powerful, external, and corroborating witness to the very supernatural history, the history of the Watchers, that they themselves had tried so desperately to suppress and to label as a myth. The Anunnaki were not a threat because they were different. They were a threat because they were the same. They were the one witness that the gatekeepers could not silence, the one piece of evidence that threatened to unravel their entire, redacted and sanitized version of primordial history. For centuries, the great unanswered question has been, are the stories of the Bible true, or are the stories of the Anunnaki true? We now know the answer. They are both true, but they are two sides of the same ancient coin. They are two battlefield reports from the same primordial war, one written by the collaborators, the other by the resistance. The Anunnaki were not gods. They were the fallen watchers. The Sumerian myths are not the original history. They are a corrupted and paganized memory of it. And the Bible is not a copy. It is the divine and authoritative correction. The Vatican's fear was never about a rival mythology. It was about a corroborating witness, an external piece of historical evidence that threatened to resurrect the very cosmic, supernatural history that they themselves had tried so desperately to bury. To understand this is to be armed with a new and powerful lens of discernment. It is to see the echoes of this ancient war not just in scripture, but in the very foundations of human religion and mythology. And so the final question is not one of history, but of allegiance. Now that you know that the gods of ancient myth may be a distorted historical memory of the biblical fallen watchers, how does this change the way you view the relationship between faith and mythology? Let us know in the comments below.